In this period, we're going to talk about what do I do with fear. We talked last week about some basic principles about emotional management, and we're going to be applying those principles to the problem of fear. What is fear? An unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. And so it's when we see that there's some danger or we anticipate that there might be some danger. It has an extremely important purpose. As we talked about last week, it's one of those negative emotions that are critical for survival. In a fallen world in which there is danger, life and death danger. It's a very useful tool that God has given to his creatures to preserve their lives. Fear gives us a warning that we might be in danger. Genesis 9, verse 2, the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. And so God gave fear to the animal kingdom at the same time that he gave them to us as food, so that they would have a natural instinct to run away from the people who would be hunting them for food. That emotion works the same way in us. It's one of the emotions that triggers the sympathetic nervous system in a very strong way, triggering what we refer to as fight or flight state of mind, almost instantaneously, within a fraction of a second. This source says a stimulus that is interpreted as dangerous will cause adrenal and pituitary glands to release about 30 different stress hormones, which changes nearly every system of the body. The heart rate and blood pressure increase, pupils dilate to allow as much light in as possible, veins in the skin constrict to send more blood to the major muscle groups. That's responsible for the chill that's sometimes associated with fear. The blood glucose level increases, muscles tense up, energized by adrenaline and glucose. And that tensing up is often what's responsible for goosebumps that we experience. The smooth muscles relax in order to allow more oxygen into the lungs, and non-essential systems like digestion and the immune system actually shut down to allow more energy for emergency functions. When we're in this state, focusing on small tasks is very difficult because the brain is being directed to focus on the big picture in order to determine where the threat is coming from. And so within a split second, your body has switched from eating your lunch to being ready to potentially have a life and death struggle with some predator, some enemy. But it also is the case that we may not be in danger. It may just be a false alarm. And so what we do with fear, the first thing we have to do is figure out if we actually are in danger, and as we'll see, take appropriate precautions. But if we're not in danger, we need to make sure that fear doesn't immobilize us. Either way, we have to do what needs to be done. So let's talk about fighting false fear. Did you know that just because you are experiencing fear and anxiety does not mean that you are actually in danger? But it's sometimes hard to know that because there's something that comes very natural to us called emotional reasoning that uses our feelings as a demonstration that something is true. For example, if we're feeling angry, we may think that must mean someone has mistreated you. It means they might have mistreated you. And as we talked about in our lesson on anger a couple of weeks ago, it's extremely important for us not to assume just because we're angry that someone has mistreated us. We have to go through the process of finding out. And it's exactly the same when we feel fear. If we're convinced just by fear that we're about to die, if we don't fight for our lives, we may end up hurting somebody. In fact, that's what happens when someone jumps from a corner to scare us. We may flail our arms in an unexpected way and smack them across the face. And if they were doing that as a prank, they probably deserved it. But again, because we feel fear is not proof that we are in danger, and that type of reasoning will lead us astray in our actions. But there are other types of stinking thinking or inaccurate thoughts, including magnification, where we're focusing on the negative instead of the positive. Labeling, jumping to conclusions is often related to fear. Mental filter, where we're focusing on negative things or disqualifying the positive. And this is what this type of stinking thinking may sound like. And I'll use an example, public speaking. I end up standing in front of a group of people several times a week, and many surveys report that close to 3/4 of the population are afraid of public speaking. And for some, from 10 to 20%, it's an extremely, even paralyzing level of fear they have towards public speaking. And I'm fortunate to be pretty used to it at this point. But how would I feel if these were the thoughts that I allowed to go through my mind as I was about ready to get up here to speak? How can I make a total fool out of myself? Or this will never work. Or I just know I'm having a heart attack or some other health disaster right now. They're all laughing at me. Just checking. It's happening all over again. I can't do this. No good can come of this. I'm doomed to failure. If those are the things that I was saying in my mind, how effective of a preacher would I be? And more importantly, how accurate are these thoughts? I check, you aren't laughing, at least on the outside, maybe on the inside. It's an important insight to recognize that many of the negative thoughts that we experience connected with strong emotions are actually untrue. That means that it's not only self-defeating to think those thoughts, but we have an obligation not to think those thoughts. And I say that because of this passage of scripture, Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, which tells us, finally, my brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. So, is it true? That filters out an awful lot of, if we think about it, the things that we may be thinking, especially when we're in the midst of negative emotions. It's natural for us to think the worst, oftentimes, of ourselves, think the worst of others, think the worst of the situation. There's only one part of us that can determine if something is true or not. Now, that is our mind. And so if I'm thinking before I get up to speak, this is going to be a total disaster, my leg is not going to say, isn't that a little bit of an exaggeration? If my mind accepts something, my entire being has to accept it as true. And that's why it's so important for us to follow the teaching of this passage, in this case, not to allow the threats or concerns that we have to become elevated, multiplied, and exaggerated by inaccurate or untrue thoughts. And so, although fear itself is a blessing from God in order to keep us alive, the thoughts that are oftentimes connected with fear exaggerate and multiply greatly the amount of distress we experience. And of course, Satan is very happy to add to that process, both to make us miserable and to attack our identity and connection with God, if possible. We're talking about how to not let fear immobilize us, and so we'll actually use the rat as an example. Jordan Peterson, a clinical psychologist, has this to say about fear and rats. If a rat sees a cat where he doesn't expect it, even if it's the first time he's ever seen a cat, he has an instinctive reaction. Usually he will run to his home and scream for about 24 hours. How scared must someone be to scream for 24 hours? And if you think about the fact that a rat only lives a year, that would be the equivalent of us screaming for over 2 months of our lives. But when he's done screaming, he leaves his home and very cautiously goes back to the same place where he saw the cat. And if the cat is not there, he begins exploring again and mapping out and adding it to his safe zone. If the rat refused to ever go back to a spot where he had ever seen or detected danger, his area for foraging would shrink and shrink until he was living in a very small world that might not be able to support him and his family. But by facing his fears and the very real possibility of danger, he is able to survive and thrive. There are many human beings whose world has shrunk very small by avoiding threats of danger. But even more than rats, facing dangers and threats is core to our nature and purpose as human beings, and is necessary for us to survive and thrive as well. Genesis 1 verse 26 tells us, that God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. This was the mission that God gave human beings, to fill the earth and subdue it. That is not a risk-free, danger-free purpose, especially since sin and death entered the world. And so to fill the earth and subdue it requires experiencing volcanoes, tornadoes, earthquakes, thunderstorms, other animals. And we've subdued some of those over the years. But again, we have things to do for God and for his kingdom that require us to face fear in order to do what needs to be done. Another important way of dealing with fear is to learn God's reasons for being unafraid. It actually is the command and will of God for us to turn away from fear. Over 80 times, God tells human beings not to fear. Sometimes that's directly, sometimes through an angel or a prophet. How many other commands are given 80 times in Scripture? Here are some examples. Jesus saying in Luke 12, why even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not then. You are of more value than many sparrows. In verse 32 of that same chapter, he said, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. And in John 14, verse 27, he said, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let them be afraid. There is someone greater and better to fear. This is another reason why we should be not afraid of some things. When there are two risks, it's very important, isn't it, to assess which is the greater danger? Because the greater danger is the one that we should give priority to responding to. Whenever fear prompts us to do something wrong or prompts us to fail to do something right, and we let that fear lead us to sin, we've fallen into a much more serious danger. That is the fear of the wrath and judgment of God. In Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 12, the prophet Isaiah gives counsel to the Israelites of his day. Do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy, and do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. The problem of that nation at that time was they had major enemies with large armies. And they spent a lot of time being afraid of this nation, their army, or this nation, their army. And it seems in their mind that the only way to deal with that threat was to make alliances with other nations who will help defend them. Their main problem was that they were not fearing God properly. If they had been in the right relationship with God, then God would have helped them overcome whatever other threats they might have faced. And so this is the counsel that he is giving them. In Matthew 10, verse 28, Jesus gives very similar counsel. Do not fear those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. So if we have a greater fear of God, we need not fear the other things that people may do to us or circumstances that our life may bring us into. Because many times fear causes us to fail to do things that we ought to do. It is the case that we sin because of fear in our Christian lives. That's why there's a warning in Revelation chapter 21, verse 8, for those whose lives are characterized or driven by fear. It says, but the cowardly, the unbelieving, the abominable, the murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. It's not a sin to be afraid, but it is a sin to let your fear keep you from doing what is right. And that's why it says the cowardly. In Hebrews chapter 4, it talks about the fact that Satan has, through fear of death, kept many human beings under bondage. And so one of the things that Jesus did was to come to destroy death and the fear of death, so we need not be cowards in that respect. Another reason for us to be unafraid is knowing God is with us. In Deuteronomy 20, verse 1, we're told, when you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Your God is with you. Paul got this message in Acts 18, verse 9, at a time that apparently he was afraid, and it had the potential of hindering his work as a gospel preacher and apostle. The Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. Paul demonstrated many times in his life that he was determined to preach the gospel, even if people attacked him and harmed him. And the reason he was able to do that is because, as Jesus reminds him at this moment, I am with you. You need not fear. And in this case, he also says here in Corinth, I'm telling you, you won't experience the things that you're afraid of. No one's going to attack you here and harm you. God was going to protect him at that particular moment and place. In Isaiah 41, verse 10, God says, fear not. Why? For I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Another reason we can be unafraid is because we can trust in God. Jeremiah 17 tells us in verse 7, blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose hope is the Lord. For he shall be like a tree planted by the waters, which spreads out his roots by the river, and will not fear when the heat comes, but his leaf will be green, and will not be anxious in the year of drought, nor will cease from yielding fruit. I don't know that trees can actually worry, but if they could, and they felt their roots drying out, oh, it's a year of drought. And so the tree starts fretting, oh no, what am I going to do? Actually, we found it in another lesson, they actually send out chemical signals to the other trees so that they can make some kind of preparation. And in the same way, if we see that it's going to be a year of drought, we should make the preparations that we can. But what we shouldn't do is fret about it, because we can trust in the Lord. And that will help us to avoid being overcome by fear or staying in a fear state, which keeps us in that fight or flight mode, which is not healthy for us and does not keep us in peace. Psalm 27, verse 1 tells us, the Lord is my light and salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Though an army may encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war may rise against me, in this I will be confident. We're living in a time when everyone is wondering if World War III is about to start. Is it a time of war? Is war going to rise against us? We should be concerned, but we should also remind ourselves of the basic truths of who we are, where we stand with God, both here and in eternity, so that we need not fear what comes. Another reason we can be unafraid is because risk has a reward. There are many things that we may risk, be hesitant about or worried about, but that we know is right and good. But if we are faithful, we will have a reward. Revelation 2, verse 10 says, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. The risk is doing God's will in spite of the danger. Is the reward worth the risk? Oh, it definitely is. So what should we do if we're afraid? Determine if you're actually in danger or not. If you are, take appropriate precautions. How much danger? How necessary is this risky action or situation? Is there some way to avoid it? Or is it something we need to do regardless of what the risk is? Make a plan to mitigate or avoid the risk as much as possible. But having done that, do not let fear immobilize you. Do what needs to be done and return from fear to peace with God by trusting in Him. Fight false fear. learn God's reasons for being unafraid. That's the command and will of God. Sometimes people feel guilty if God says, do not fear, that if they're feeling afraid that they're sinning by breaking that command. But I think God saying, do not fear, it grammatically is a command, but I think is actually an encouragement where God is saying, if I were you, I would not be afraid. And that might be a way to think about that, because if God is telling us do not fear, he knows our circumstances. He's not afraid of the circumstances that we're in. And so we need not fear. There's someone greater or better to fear. God is with us. We can trust in God. And we know that risking for God has a reward. Hope this lesson has been encouraging to you.